Welcome to the 36th episode of the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we're going to be speaking with Pooja, Roma, Grace, and Nikita, who are the founders and operators of Allies for Black Voices, a project associated with the Loudoun County division of the NOW, National Organization for Women. Their goal is to create and share a platform to help Black people in the community to share their views, their ideas, and their experiences in hopes of achieving greater justice in our local community, and I assume maybe large scale nationally as well. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So for the people who have listened to the ClassCast podcast more regularly, you know that this is the biggest group that we've ever talked with. We've done a few small groups, but we have 4 different speakers. And so we're going to take just a quick minute. I'm going to kick it over to them and give each of our 4 speakers just a moment to quickly introduce themselves. And then we're going to get back into focus on the work itself, what they're doing, and how this organization is really trying to shape and improve our community. So I'll just go in the order I have listed. Pooja, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, where you go to school, what you do, how you got involved?
Sure. Hi. Thanks again for having us. So I am Pooja. I am a rising sophomore now, as are the rest of us at William & Mary, but I also attend the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I split my time between 2 schools. I'm an international relations major getting a joint degree. And I've been involved in the grassroots since I was younger. I actually know a lot of the Loudoun County National Organization of Women because back in high school, I ran a nonprofit that trained young women to run for office. And so this is sort of an extension of the work that I've had the privilege to do in the past. And Grace, Roma, and Nikita are some of my closest friends from high school, and I'll let them go next.
All right. So thank you. That sounds great. Grace, a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us again. Obviously, I'm Grace. I am also a rising sophomore. I go to Colorado State University, where I am majoring in communication studies and minoring in film studies. I've known these people almost my entire life, and it's been such an incredible opportunity to work on this project, to do something for the greater good, and to be able to do it with my best friends. I'm here because I was tired of just sitting around and feeling like I wasn't doing enough with all of the injustices that are occurring in the world, and I wanted to do something, and that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. So that's great, and it's maybe a nice way to get off the sidelines. Next up, Roma.
Hi, I'm Roma. I'm also a rising sophomore at the University of Virginia. I am a Spanish and biochemistry double major, and I also got involved one day because we were going out to a protest the next day. And I was really worried because of the whole situation with Corona, like the whole pandemic, and then also going out and protesting. And I realized that because of the pandemic, there's a huge audience that, isn't being reached because they're stuck at home and they don't necessarily know much about what's happening, or they aren't able to go to protests like this. And I thought we got to do something about that. And so that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. That's great. And actually, that's probably something we maybe want to talk about later, is the intersection of pandemic and lockdown and quarantine with the protests, not just the act of protest itself, but maybe a little bit of how the social climate was set in, all this was sort of set in motion maybe in certain ways by people being at home, people watching the news, people having a little more free time on their hands. And in some ways that might be good or bad, but it's interesting you point that out, like as you're thinking about going to a protest, how you have these 2 stresses sort of pulling at you, and how that maybe creates a dynamic that I don't know if it's better or worse, but at least at the moment it appears that there's a lot of momentum for this movement. And so maybe that's something we get into a little bit more later. Next up, we have Nikita. Nikita, welcome. Just a little bit about yourself.
Thank you again, and probably the last one to say this, but I am also a rising sophomore. I'm going to Cornell right now, and I'm a bio major and a climate science minor. And I guess the reason I'm here is they've pretty much covered it, but basically Roma just kind of texted us one day and was like, hey guys, like, I don't think we're doing enough. Like, obviously, like, people were starting to really make a noise on social media. Like, there were posts circulating and all, but we were like, I don't know, like, social media doesn't feel like should be the end game or end point of all of this. So we were like, how can we take it further? And then Roma came up with the idea and then just got us started with everything.
That's great. And so Roma, you're kind of the mastermind or the catalyst for this. So for those who can't see this, she's shaking her head right now, but everyone else is nodding. So at some point we're going to put you on the spot and make you explain that motivation. Yeah. And maybe just to the social media point, I think it's important because it's so easy to say something on social media. Like if you're not really risking a whole lot, you're behind your keyboard, it's safe. And when a certain idea or a certain change in society starts to become more popular or acceptable, it gets a little momentum, it's even easier to say something. And I think that in a way that's a good thing, personal opinion, I think it's a good thing. But I also think that maybe that makes us a little bit sort of lazy about things, because you feel like, well, I shared this, I said this, and I donated $10. And, we feel like maybe we've done more than we have at that moment. It's actually one of the reasons I started the podcast. I found myself like having a lot of talks about education and how, we do okay, but we could really do a million times better. And then I realized that just having that conversation one-on-one over and over was not having as much impact. And so at least this way I can do the same conversation, but try to include a larger audience, which increases the chance that other people sort of join in or find ideas that work for them. So I'll send it back to you and any one of you that would like to clarify, because I did the quick introduction to what Allies for Black Voices is, and we got a little information there about how you got started. But after that initial text message, after the initial sort of discussion of, yeah, let's do something, how did you decide that you were going to try to create a platform where you could showcase, correct me if I'm wrong, but to this point, most of what you've done, you're showcasing other people, you're having Black people speak, share their ideas, and try to create an opportunity for a larger audience to get some ideas out and to create that change. So first, if I'm wrong, obviously clarify, but what made that the goal? Like how did you go from your original text message of let's do something to what you're actually doing now? Like how did all this form?
Sure. I hope the others don't mind if I answer this one. So essentially, Roma and Grace and Nikita had all been planning to go to a protest. And I believe they actually did go to this protest, but what ended up happening was there was a lot of concern regarding health because it's during a pandemic. And obviously they were socially distant and it was a peaceful protest, and thank God they're all healthy. I at the time couldn't go because I had just dealt with recovering from the virus and my best friend was still sick. And so I chose to stay back. And the discussion was surrounding, like you said previously, how do we handle this intersection of a pandemic with this very clear racial injustice that is happening in our nation. And there are so many people that just couldn't go to protests at the time, whether you were immunocompromised or, had other familial obligations. For example, if you were a parent that couldn't leave your children at home to go out to a protest, if you were older and getting the virus could potentially kill you, or you didn't want to bring it back to your family, it was really hard to go out and feel like you were part of this movement. And it was something that I struggled with on my own, and all three of them struggled with as well. And so what it came down to was I looked at Roma and I said, okay, let me think about a solution. And together we came up with this idea of the video sessions. And of course, Roma was the mastermind behind what we do. But Loud Now, the president of Loud Now and the vice president are two really important people. The vice president is our former English teacher, so very important to all of us. But the president is someone that I met back when I was 15. And so she texted me back at 3 a.m, which is when Roma sent me her text, and said, yes, absolutely, let's hop on the phone. And we got a Zoom session together, and we realized, we have technology, we have Grace, who is incredible at everything media and communication. We have Roma and Nikita, who have some of the most passionate activists, climate change wise, that I have ever met. And so we just pulled together all of our individual strengths, with mine being the network that I had built when I was younger, and realized this was the most feasible thing. And again, we did not want our face to be on this movement. So if you notice, if you go to any of the Allies for Black Voices pages, there's one video where Grace, Roma, and myself are speaking about the introduction of Black Voices of the organization. And we state very clearly that it's the last time our face is really going to be on anything, because everything is focused on the Black voices that we that are so lovely and come speak. Again, because it's not the responsibility of the Black community to educate. And we've been so fortunate to have so many speakers that are willing to take time out of their day and enhance the education of so many communities. And that's how we got here.
Can I add something to that real quick? So I did see this one post on social media, obviously, that was social media and Instagram specifically is kind of like an echo chamber. So what they meant by that was a lot of the people you follow, the people you interact with, and then people who follow you are most likely going to be in agreement with your ideas. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, especially because it is a mostly younger audience, and Gen Z, quote unquote, is known to be more on the progressive end of things, just because we have grown up seeing all this and everything has been exposed at the bare seams to us. And the problem with that is that a lot of the people who are voters, a lot of them are older aged, aren't necessarily exposed to the same ideas that we are constantly seeing on social media. So we thought that this would also be a good way to break out of that echo chamber, kind of, and like get to that older audience who like may or may not be familiar with the ideas of the people that we bring on our platform to speak about.
That's great. And I'm glad you added that, because I think that's an important point. And I try to be careful with certain terms that get kind of trendy, because sometimes they turn into cliches real fast. I feel like echo chamber is one, but we don't have a better word for it. And I think it's something that we all need to be very, very cautious of, because sometimes we get a false sense of security or confidence. We think that a lot of people agree with us, and we don't always realize whether we have a majority or a minority opinion or things like that. Like, just as a quick like side example, there's all this talk about should schools open in person or online in the fall. And if you participate in any of like the Facebook groups or like, you know, any of the Twitter chats or anything about this, that you get the sense that almost all the teachers wanted to stay home. And now they're releasing the data from the surveys, and it's like, oh yeah, no, like 55-60% of teachers want to go back into the schools. And some people were completely like, minds were blown, because they had no idea, because you're only interacting with this small group of people who also chose to find those outlets and to have that discussion. And I think that for race or maybe even for a lot of political issues, we have to be very careful about that. I have a lot of friends all over the political spectrum. I probably have more pro-Confederate flag or statue friends on my, newsfeed than probably all of you combined. And while, my wife's sometimes like, why don't you just like unfollow that person? And I'm like, because if I don't see it, I don't know it's there. Because if I don't see it, I don't have the chance once in a while to drop a comment or send the link, because I don't think this is like a flat out terrible person. We are friends. And the fact that we have a disagreement, and maybe an important one, doesn't mean that we need to like shut off those lines of communication. And so for me, I think it's more important to open the lines of communication than to shut them off. As easy it is to unfriend or unfollow or do whatever else, like sometimes I really have to stop and think like, maybe having that person upset me once in a while is actually good for me, because I need to know that that voice exists, because that's the person I really need to talk to. So to bring this back to your point, for your audience, you mentioned older people, we talked about a lot of different people who maybe don't attend protests or couldn't, or, et cetera. There's a lot of different ways to have these discussions. And if we think about the Martin Luther King line from Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he's grown, I forget how he says it, but he's grown tired of the white moderate, the person who's in words, they say they agree, but in action, no, they don't do anything. In fact, they're always saying like, slow down, be patient, whatever. He said that that's a worse enemy than the KKK. That person who says, in theory, I agree, and he keeps talking about the white moderate as being the real enemy, because they say they want to help, but they don't actually do anything and actually slow things down quite a bit. And I think that when you hear that, there's a lot of white moderates who either balk at the idea or who very quickly try to say, I'm not a moderate. And, just by definition, that's probably not true, right? Moderate would just mean average, or where most people are. So for a platform like you're trying to create, is the goal to change minds? Like, are you trying to reach out and find people who have different views of race and racial justice and change it? Or are you trying to find, I want to say find, but are you trying to connect, say, with the people who are maybe in that moderate area where they have this vague understanding and kind of agree, but don't know enough and don't know what to do? Like, who do you target with the speakers and with this platform? What is that particular group, and what is the outcome you would like for them?
Our Zoom sessions are live, obviously. The people that we have attend the meeting are usually people who are specifically interested in that speaker. So our first speaker, George Lee, he has a significant following on social media. And so the people that attended that were either people who knew us or people who knew George Lee. And that trend has kind of continued with our other speakers, where it's been people who wanted to come, came to the meeting. But the nice thing about what we've been doing is that we've been recording the meetings and we've been uploading them on YouTube. And what I've personally been doing is, if there is someone in my life who I feel might benefit from that education and benefit from hearing that kind of perspective, I send it to them. And I encourage them to listen to it. And whether they do listen to it or not, that's on them. But I do think conversations like that are super important, and listening to the Black community is super important. And if we're providing people with these resources, I think that is, at the end of the day, the most that we can do. Our goal is to spark these important conversations and obviously listen to the Black community. And it's resulted in some uncomfortable conversations. I mean, I sit down at dinner with my family, and they don't always agree with a lot, well, not a lot, but with some of the things that I say. And so I have continued to encourage them to come to the meetings. I've sent them the link to the YouTube video. We are doing our part to try to get this education and this perspective out there. And so that really has been our goal with the recording of the meeting.
What kind of feedback are you getting from anyone? I mean, it sounds like, and that's essentially how a podcast works, especially at first, By the way, I should toss it out there that Pooja mentioned that the vice president of Loudon Now did she teach all of you? Was Ms. Berg, was your English teacher? So she was the guest on the third episode of this podcast, which I think was both great and terrible. And it was great because we had this awesome conversation. Like, I'd only met her once in the past. I just thought she would be a good person to talk to. And we talked it was almost like 2 hours. And then we talked for almost an hour after it was done recording, like on our way out of the library. And so like, she's great, but that episode got a lot of traction, but it was mostly because people either knew me and wanted to hear it, or people knew her and they wanted to hear it. And it's only more recently, this is episode 36. It's only probably in the last 6 to 8 that I'm actually having random people who I've never heard of, reach out and say, hey, I heard this, it's great. And so, for sometimes to grow that audience, I think takes a little bit of time, but it sounds like, I checked out some of the YouTube videos and some of them have a lot of views. So I think it's very much working in the right direction. When you're thinking about the uncomfortable parts, because I do want to ask you about some of the guests and all that too, but sometimes the most important thing in these conversations is to acknowledge that it's going to be uncomfortable, and that at some point, especially when we're speaking, we always say like, and sometimes it's hard to listen, but if you just sit and listen, that's fine because you can learn. But at some point you probably need to ask a question or make a comment so that you're fully engaged. But that also means you're taking a little bit of a risk, especially like I'll use myself as a, middle class, upper middle class, straight white male. Like, I'm not the guy that needs to be speaking too much during these conversations. But I also feel like if you don't engage at all, you're not engaged, So sometimes there has to be a little bit of risk taking involved. Like, people have to recognize that I'm going to hear something I may not like, or I'm going to say something that maybe other people won't like. And I keep trying to remind my friends, or, I do this in class a lot, that the goal is that everyone gets better. And so when someone says something stupid or hurtful and it was accidental, like that's your chance to educate. Like, you educate ignorance, you punish malice. And so when someone has that moment and it's not a malicious thing, like, and it's probably easy for me to say this as a white person, but that's my moment where I say, like, that's where we probably need to forgive and redirect and correct the person. When it's a malicious statement, we can respond a little bit differently. But either way, some people don't want to actively engage or feel so hesitant. You feel like you're always sort of being watched at this point. Anything you say is going to end up on Twitter and you can be in trouble. So, and Grace, I don't mean to refer specifically to like your conversations with your family, but for any of you, or for maybe what you've heard from the speakers, what are some of the less comfortable moments, or what are some of the things that have come out of this that you think were productive but difficult? Because probably the most educational parts are sometimes the hardest ones. So that the readers or listeners understand what we're talking about, like, what have been a couple of those moments that have really been challenging for you?
Yeah, so I want to speak to a slightly different demographic. So the girls make fun of me for saying this all the time, but my senior year of high school, instead of going to Rockridge, I moved to Germany. And that was something I was really fortunate to do. But I also, obviously people can't see me. I'm a 5'1" Indian female in the region of Germany that has the tallest people in the world and is also homogeneously white, and they had never met an Indian before. So having those racial conversations was already really difficult to begin with. They told me that I had an Indian accent when I spoke German, which is impossible because I was born in Ohio. Like, a lot of really difficult conversations. And I've noticed those conversations drag here, but like drag back to me moving back to the States. And like you said, they're not malicious comments, right? It's usually just ignorance because they haven't met a person of color before. And every interaction they've ever had with a person of color is usually a refugee, which is not to say that any of their comments are justified. They just don't know how to interact with people different than them. And so when I moved to Germany, I didn't speak the language. And I think when I left, I helped them really understand how to interact with immigrants and other people that didn't speak the language as well. But coming back to the States, I post a lot on my social media about the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the injustices here. And it's hard because when I was abroad, I served as a junior ambassador. So I was speaking on behalf of the United States. And it's really hard when people know me in that light and see me posting all of this, even though I obviously love the country that I'm from. And it's just the comments I get back are crude, right? People like comment on my Instagram stories and like make really rude comments about America and the United States and write us off as an entire country. And it's really frustrating to have to explain to them that these are structural and institutionalized systems that are the byproduct of like a very, very long and very bad history. And yes, we have to critique our government, but it's not as easy as they think it is. It's not as black and white. And so those conversations are hard to have because they are already racist in general towards Black people, because I think they just know zero. I didn't see a single person. The only Black kid at my school was the one that we brought from America, right? So that's been the hard part, is talking to other members of my community that are abroad. And I have a lot of friends that live in like rural Virginia or southern, like super southern Virginia, or back in Ohio, that it's just as foreign to them. And like you said, it's not malintentioned, but I think it's just exhausting. I think it's just emotionally tiring to have those conversations and constantly have to educate. But again, it's not the responsibility of the Black community. And, we all need to be picking up the slack to have these conversations.
I have a couple of good friends. Well, one's a good friend and one's a former work friend, acquaintance, who have talked about that. Black friends who have said, just this has been exhausting. My wife is part of a support group that she runs. My wife runs a nonprofit, and one of the members is a Black woman, and it's for child loss. And so it's already difficult conversations. And one woman actually just texted my wife today, and she said, so make sure you text me, let me know what's going on, because I can't keep up with social media. She's like limiting herself to 10 to 15 minutes a day on her phone because it's so stressful. And she's like, I'm just exhausted, but I'm exhausted and not doing anything. Like, it's not like I'm exhausted, with action. And so I think that that's an important thing for everyone to remember, is that this is difficult, and it's probably more difficult for a Black person. And so, when I see white friends post things like, can we all just get over this? I'm getting tired of hearing about all this stuff. I'm like, man, you got tired after like 3 months. Can you imagine, like, Black people have been tired for generations. And so maybe we need to have a little bit more empathy at that moment. Like, you can personally be over it, but you probably don't need to tell everyone else to shut up about it. That's a tough conversation. And that's one that I've had several times recently, is that maybe you just need to be patient and let it ride. Grace, I'm sorry to cut you off. I thought that idea of that fatigue is important, because I think that's what's setting it with the news media. Like, protests are still going on all over the country, but suddenly we're not seeing it on the news quite as much as we did a few weeks ago. And I think that's because people are getting tired or bored, but that doesn't mean that the work is done. Having some resources available, I think, is really important too, because sometimes people get into these conversations for all good reasons. But if you hit a point where you meet resistance, it's not always easy to do this. For example, the term anti-racist has gotten very popular in the last few months. And as a teacher who, I've only recently kind of gotten active on Twitter, but, since we haven't been in school, I don't have a captive audience to talk to, and I talk a lot. So I've been using Twitter. And in a lot of these Twitter chats, you're exchanging ideas with other teachers. And it's amazing how many people put the word anti-racist in their profile. And I'm like, that doesn't do anything. And if you weren't already doing quote unquote anti-racist things in your classes last school year, you've done nothing in the last 2 months to like quote, deserve the title, so to speak. And so I think sometimes having the resources is important. Like, I grew up in a almost entirely white, semi-rural suburban town in Pennsylvania. I had almost no awareness of any of this stuff, and it would have probably been easier for me my senior year of high school to make a racist joke than to stop one. And it was in college. I took a lot of demographics classes and evolutionary biology classes, and I got really interested then. And so this has actually been a part of my English class as long as I've been a teacher. Like, we do this sort of unit on race, quote unquote, that actually lasts about 4.5 months. It's sort of it starts as a unit and then the unit ends, but then the next 2 things we do are still sort of about race, and we just let it go that way. And so as a result, I have a lot of stuff. Like, I have materials, I have short texts, I have long texts, I have documentaries I recommend. And so one of the reasons that I think I, on average, am more comfortable in these conversations than maybe a lot of my white friends is not that I care more or less. It's just because I've had the conversation and I have the stuff. And so in part of like creating a platform like this, where you're gathering speakers, and that means you have the video of that, you have their ideas, you also have that platform where you can share other information to help other people through these conversations or when this gets tough. I do want to reference a former student of mine who attends Cornell as well, V. Nguyen, and one of her friends, and I don't remember the name of the other person. I just read through this. They put together, it's not done yet, but it's like 80 pages of information on race, and they released it as like, there's like the abridged version is like 60 pages and the full one with citations is like 80. And it's all these resources about racism and anti-racism and how to address it. And she is East Asian American. I'm not sure where her family's from, but a few of the pieces specifically address the conversation for like how anti-Black racism functions within an East Asian family. And I thought it was great. And she did it because she's like, I just kept having these conversations with my family and it wasn't going well. And I realized that everyone else is, all of her friends are trying to do this too. And so she and a friend just like made it a pet project, and they've put together this amazing compilation of articles and research and all this stuff. It's fantastic. Now, it's not something that anyone's probably going to sit down and read for pleasure, but for the person who wants to know, maybe say for the kind of person who's showing up to hear your speakers, it's an incredible opportunity to get that information so that you have some backup and a little more confidence in the conversations. With the speakers, I guess, how do you find them, or do they find you? Like, we've sort of talked about your audience. How do you identify the voices that you want? Like, I know you're like made the platform and now you're sort of hands off and you don't want your faces or names attached. It's for other people. But in the end, there has to be some kind of filter. So how do you decide who's going to speak, or like, what's that selection process or search process like?
Well, Roma wants Michelle Obama, but I'll let Roma talk about recruitment. She did a lot in our early days.
Hey, and by the way, Roma, just real fast, you get a couple of these talks done and you have a couple positive reviews and you send the request and you just do it. I've been amazed. I have only had one person. I haven't asked too many crazy people, but I've only had one person who flat out said no, they didn't want to be on this podcast, and it was because they thought they would get fired from their job. Like, I have people lined up every few weeks for like the next 3 months or something. Every single person says yes, or I'd like to, but we need to find time later. So I think you should stick to the Michelle Obama dream, because
that's what we're saying.
I think you probably have a better chance than you believe you do. So, yeah, sorry. So Roma, how did you go about getting, say, the first speakers, and how do you do that moving forward?
So I remember initially when we first had the meeting talking about this project, we decided that we didn't want to limit our speakers in any sort of sense. So when we find speakers, a lot of the time it's just me on TikTok and I see someone talking about like all of these important issues and they have such an important and prominent voice. And I'm like, I need other people to hear this. Like, I need them to hear what I'm hearing. But at the same time, we also want people from our community who feel like they don't have many opportunities to speak up about their own experiences and how they feel living in Loudoun County or in Nova in general. And we also wanted different perspectives. So we reached out to everybody that we all kind of wanted to talk to, but a lot of them were centered around themes. Like we just recently had a Black business owner, Teresa Black, talk about what it's like being Black in business. And then George Lee, who's from Oklahoma, nowhere near here, but his experiences being a Black person in a predominantly like rural area are very, very different from what we have here. So we just kind of wanted to bring other people's experiences to our little, I don't like calling it like an enclosed bubble, but sometimes it feels that way in Loudoun County. So.
And you're right. The local sort of demographics or the local culture is something that I think we probably all need to be careful of. I actually live in Clark County, which is one county west of Loudoun County, where I assume you all live and went to high school. It's where I teach. And you only have to go, 40, 45 minutes west from where you're at to where I live to what I call real Virginia. Culturally, it's noticeably different, say, than what you might see in Ashburn or in Reston or something like that. And it doesn't mean that any of the racial concerns are less severe, but I think they play out a little bit differently in communities that are more heterogeneous, that are on average a little bit wealthier. And so it's, I have students all the time in class and we're going through like the initial sort of the race day. Like I have a race day where I give a quiz and it's awful. Like I give them like these like science articles and biology articles about like, what is race? What is racism? What is it really? It's kind of nothing. We just make it up and all agree to it. And so they have all the information, and then their reading quiz, as I ask them 10 questions, they're all about the most obvious and stupid racial stereotypes. And they all look around like, what? how am I supposed to say who runs the fastest? And they're like flabbergasted, and they look, and I'm like, you just have to answer the questions, and everybody gets 100%, but I give bonus to the kids who write something from the reading, like race is a poor indicator, race doesn't exist. But they, in that discussion, because as soon as the quiz is done, the entire rest of the class is just talking. We just talk about it, talk about why people think this stuff. That way, when we get into the actual readings, we've already had the uncomfortable moment. We've all taken a little risk. Now we're in this together, and the conversation goes well. But you'd be amazed at how many people say, we don't have those problems in Northern Virginia. We don't have those problems in the DC metro area. And I'm like, the DC metro area includes a lot of places you're not thinking about, and you're also disregarding DC itself. And so I think you're right in sharing some of those ideas, and maybe from people outside the community. With the first one, by the way, George Lee was your first guest. Yeah. That was the one I watched. I watched a few clips of each of them as we get ready for this talk, but that was the one I probably watched a little bit more of. And he was awesome. Like, he was really enthusiastic, and like he went for it, and that was cool. Was that someone you found on TikTok?
Yes, actually, Nikita found George Lee on TikTok, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, basically the plan was to just like email anyone we could find, as Roma said, and it was a long shot for me because like he has like, I think a like accumulated total of like 500,000 followers. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like over 500,000.
Yeah, it's a lot. He has a lot of followers. So I just like, I emailed him out of like the blue, and I was like, I don't even think I'm going to get a response from him. But then we did. And I was so utterly shocked, and we're like, okay, we got to get him on immediately. So we picked him as our first speaker.
It was actually really funny because Grace, Roma, we were going to McDonald's, and we got the email, and we were freaking out. It was relatively late. I think we freaked out for 2 straight hours. We drafted the email together, called everyone we knew, called Nikita, told her to come like drive through, meet us at McDonald's, which she didn't come. But we were like screaming. And it was so much fun to, like you said, Mr. Tibbens, is the worst you can do is ask. And most people tend to say yes, but still, every yes feels like an absolute honor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember so I'm primarily in charge of the Instagram account, and I was getting all of these notifications on our Instagram that we had posted one time on it. And I was like, we have like 10 followers. Why are we getting so many notifications? And then I opened the Instagram, and I see that George Lee posted the flyer on his main Instagram account without even like letting us know, without us even posting the flyer first. We just sent it to him, and he posted on his Instagram, tagged us. We're like, oh my God. It was just like, it was such a cool moment. And then I was like, oh my gosh, wait, now I really have to get it together. Like, now I have to get it on the Instagram account. This is really, really happening. So that was such a cool moment. And we were so grateful to have Mr. Lee. He really was. And to have him kick our series off was just incredible.
That's awesome. Like I said, I didn't know anything about him before watching some of the, now I want to go back and watch more of it, but I had it on last night. My wife was yelling at me because she was trying to like watch something on television. I was like, all right, this guy's really interesting though. Like, hang on. Yeah. And I think it's important for anyone. I mean, and I'll say this just for anyone listening, but maybe for you as well. And I have to remind myself of this, but like when you're trying to create a platform where people can share good ideas, most people want to share good ideas. I invited you onto the podcast, but it was because Jessica Berg suggested it to me, and I was like, oh, well, hey, that actually sounds great, and she was on the podcast before. I was like, that sounds fantastic. Most people want the chance to talk about what they're doing or what they're into. And so if you're ever in the middle of a project or you need a speaker or something like that, Pooja, like you said, the worst thing that happens when you ask is they say no. Like, this applies for everyone, but I shouldn't probably say this to a group associated with now. This is mildly sexist, but I give this advice to young men all the time. Women probably need to hear it too, but nice guys in high school really struggle with this whole just like, ask that girl if she would like to go have food with you. And like, I can't ask her. I'm like, why? She might say no. And I'm like, yeah, dummy. That's like, there's literally 2 options. It's yes or no. And you should just ask and let her say no. And he's like, but trust me, like, just ask. And you'll find that that's a really important thing personally, but professionally. And now, thinking about the platform you're creating, you always just ask. And in this case, you're actually providing a service both to the community and giving an opportunity to other people to share their ideas. So how many speakers have you had to this point? Is it 4 or 5?
Okay.
How many do you have people like lined up, or like what's the schedule? Like I always say I want to do a podcast every 2 weeks. And during the summer, it's been a little bit quicker than every 2 weeks. during the school year I'm a little bit slower, it's whatever. But like, is your goal one a month, one every few weeks? Like what pace do you try to keep in terms of having speakers share their ideas?
Yeah, so we have a speaker every single week for the rest of the summer. So it's usually a 4 p.m. session. I think we have one session coming up that's not going to be at 4 p.m. and the day is based on the speaker. But yeah, it's a huge deal. I think 2 weeks into the project, we had speakers confirmed for the whole summer. And so I think that's our last week is, I think the week of the 24th to the 28th. And, the project might even continue. So we'll see.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, the funniest part was, like, when we were initially planning this, like, we had the lowest approach. We were like, we can at least aim for, like, once a month, just because, like, we thought that we wouldn't be able to find that many people, or just, like, not many people would, like, want to speak or something. But it ended up, the way it is right now. And also, like, I think the best part about having it be so regular is that, like, this movement in general, it has come over and over again and become a thing. Like, it's, like, rose and, like, fallen, I guess, in terms of, like, trending on social media. Like, I hate saying that. Like, I hate, like, the word even trend being associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, but that's kind of, like, how it has been. And that's the worst part, is, like, that it fades in people's memories. And, like, I think the good thing about having it be so regular is that we're trying to make sure that it doesn't really fade. Like, it's always going to be there now. Like, I want it from this moment on, not saying that we're the ones doing anything, like, to ensure that, but, like, us and everybody, like, out there on social media right now, like, we wanted to make sure, like, that it is a continuous thing. It's not something that just fades and is, like, a trend, essentially.
And that's one of my personal hopes, is that with the way Black Lives Matter has, I think, become more than just a trend. Even when you're not a trend, it doesn't mean that you'll always be popular per se. I'm hoping that this is sort of the tipping point. And I know that a lot of people have said that, and probably a lot of Black people have said that with greater intensity than I have in the past. But I haven't done it in a while, but I have a little, like, one day lesson on race riots, quote unquote, that I made after the Baltimore riots a few years ago, because it happened and we were in the middle of doing something else. But I was watching the news one night and I had 3 students email me while I was watching the news. And I thought, if students are that interested that they're going to go out of their way to send their teacher an email at 11 o'clock at night because they're also watching the news, like, let's talk about it. So I stayed up until like 3 a.m. and made a PowerPoint and had, like, video clips and a short reading and all that stuff. And one of the things that shocked me that I had never realized was that, there's unrest on and off all the time, but it's sort of like a give or take, like a 40-year cycle. You have sort of shortly after the Civil War, the beginnings of Reconstruction, and there's all this push towards voting rights and all the rest. And then things go very bad for most Black people in the United States. And then in the 19-teens, it starts to look like it's going to get better. And then there were a lot of race riots actually by white people then. And then things sort of died down for a little bit. And then you get into the mid-1950s through the late 1960s. There's like that 15-year period of civil rights movement where there's a lot of progress. And then everything sort of died down. And the fact that we're still having this discussion, say 40, 50 years later, I really, really hope that this is not just like another sort of moment in that cycle, and that we find some ways that there can be some structural changes. I don't think you're ever going to change every person's heart. Like, I don't think the trick is to try to get every person to stop having racist ideas, because people all over the world, like all kinds of people, have certain biases. And I don't know that that's a thing that we can fix, or certainly that we'll fix easily. But we can certainly change maybe the ways we handle law enforcement or education or healthcare, because those are matters of policy and legislation. And I'm hoping that maybe this is the time we actually get more of those things done, because it would feel terrible if in 30 or 40 years we find ourselves having the same discussion again about the same kind of stuff. At some point, something's got to change. I mentioned education, and this is a, mostly education and culture, but mostly education related podcast. Thinking either about your own education or thinking about how you might want to change or improve some of these things, what can or should we do in schools to support anti-racism or the Black Lives Matter movement? Like, what did you learn in school that was not helpful, or what was, you see what I'm saying? Like, do we change a curriculum? Do we hire a different teacher? Like, how do we use the infrastructure of a public education system to help to facilitate some of these big changes that we're talking about? Because that might be one of the best ways to do it. Now, granted, if you change, someone in high school has the idea, you might have to give it 10 or 20 years until that person's into their career. And that's unfortunate, but that is a place where we have the opportunity to make broad-based changes is through schools. So what would you say if you were given the opportunity to make some changes there? Like, what do you think we can do educationally to improve racial justice in our society?
I think, well, first of all, school is where it all starts, obviously. That's where we learn everything K through 12. What I will say, though, is I am blessed to be in the area that I am in, to have gotten such a good education at good schools. What I will say is that I learned more about the world in my first year of college than I did in my K through 12 career. And I know that might not be the case for everybody. And it might also be because I go to school in Colorado. So I live in Virginia, went to school in Virginia, but I go to school. I go to college across the country. But I felt like in high school specifically, I wasn't learning anything outside of our country. And even what we were learning in our country was whitewashed. As a result, because at least the classes I was taking, they weren't pushing me beyond, like they kind of set it up as, you know, slavery was an issue, but it's not an issue anymore. Like racism doesn't exist. And as a white person, that's comfortable for me to hear. You know, like I don't have to experience racism. So having someone tell me that racism really isn't a problem anymore and Black people aren't slaves, great. I can sleep well at night, you know, but
how many Black teachers did you have in your public education?
I know 2 Black teachers.
Not many. Yeah, not many.
And one is not a teacher; she's an administrator.
Okay, yeah, I asked because you say, you know, like slavery is a problem, but then it's done, and then racism, and you know, I think sometimes those are issues with how the curriculum is written or with the textbook that you're handed, and that's why, you know, I'm a classroom teacher and I have no interest in ever being a principal because it sounds like a terrible job. Like I'd love the money, but not the work. Like I like to teach, but I also would like to be more involved in the discussion of curriculum or the structure of school. And that's what this podcast is all about. Like try to do the big ideas. You know, I had no Black teachers, 0 through my entire the first time I had a Black teacher, I was in college. But I also, like I said, I lived in a very white area growing up. And so I wonder how much of the bias that you're hearing that maybe was revealed to you or adjusted, you know, once you got to university, how much of that is the result of those teachers, whether it's intentional or unintentional, versus how much of that is curriculum. Like my guess is that, I don't know, do you guys know Myron Curtis? He's a history teacher. Check him out on TikTok. He's got, I don't know, tens of thousands of followers, and he does like little mini history lessons, but he's fantastic. And like none of his students would walk away with any of those ideas, but that's because he goes out of his way to do it. And so when you say like, this is my experience, I wonder how much of that is because of the school system versus how much of that is because the people teaching the classes. But you said when you got to college, your feelings about some of this changed. Like how did they do it differently at college than they did in high school? Right.
Yes. A lot of it has to do with the curriculum. And I think that the curriculum, specifically in history classes, I think is where a lot of it was lacking and it was whitewashed. I feel like the curriculum was looking at a timeline and was going through these events. And once we got past it, we didn't talk about it anymore. So once we got past the point where we were talking about slavery, we didn't really talk about it anymore. We didn't talk about how the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it allowed it in prison, that prison labor is present. So I think, at least in my experience, because of that curriculum, we didn't have to think any farther than what we were learning. In college, I took history. I took 2 history classes and a women's studies class. And it was those classes that I realized I was like, oh my gosh. I remember specifically, and I would recommend this movie. It's called 13th. It's on Netflix. I remember watching that in my women's studies class, and that was the moment it clicked for me. I was like, oh, so there's a really, really, really big problem, and it is very much still here. So my point being is that at least the school that I went to in my experience, I think the curriculum is very much flawed. And I think we're setting students up, at least white students up, for me, to not realize that there still are problems. Like I said before, racism doesn't impact me and I don't have to think about it when I leave class. And I feel like the curriculum is setting up these white students to continue this cycle of ignorance. because we're treating this education as just, oh, I have to take a test, let me memorize these dates and stuff. And once we step outside the classroom, we're not thinking about the long-lasting impacts of some of these historical events that we're learning about. So I think I had the teachers that I had were incredible people. They really were. I think the education system is flawed because of the curriculum a majority of the time.
Grace talked about history, but when I went to college, I realized that it's so much more than that. It's literally every single subject that has been whittled down to talk about specific things and leave out other things. Like when I went to college, I took a bioethics class, and we learned about really, really important things like the eugenics movement and the Tuskegee trials, syphilis trials, and a lot of these other things that are just completely ignored in science. And a lot of people like to say that, you know, math and science are married, but I think that's really oversimplifying it. Every subject that we learn in, you know, K through 12 are intertwined, and the reason we are here at this situation today isn't because of separate things. Like they're all connected in that sense. And I learned a lot of that in college.
It's something that has come up a lot in this podcast, especially in maybe the last, 10, 15 episodes. And it was, and I think you guys will see this as you have more speakers, that there's going to be certain themes that will develop that you didn't expect. Like there's certain things I expected would just come up and that I would have to keep talking about or hearing people talk about. There's certain things that I didn't. One of them is how important maybe the idea of like interdisciplinary studies are. The idea that like we keep the subject areas separate in ways that don't make sense and don't reflect reality. And that's like the beginning of like the word university. Like the uni is one and verse is the way, and the universe is like, you're supposed to learn how it all connects. And the idea of like separating them out too strictly doesn't work. Just like a timeline, like it should be a time web, you know? And so when you take the class and the teacher tries to squeeze the entire timeline in, or your bio teacher has so much to do that they don't teach you a little of the history of who discovered what or what else was going on in the world that made the person ask the question in the first place, you know, and those are the things that I think make it more interesting, but that also make it harder to teach in a way, if your goal is to cover this massive timeline. Like I think sometimes we try to do too much, and as a result, we get very little done, you know, and so we draw these fake lines. Pooja, sorry, she no one can see this. She's had her hand up for a moment, and that was refreshing because I haven't had students in class since March, and I haven't seen a person raise their hand, and my heart is so happy. Sorry,
my heart was happy when you said interdisciplinary studies, because I am an international relations major, so that is everything that we do is like interdisciplinary studies. But I wanted to sort of hone in on that in the way that my experience with other education, I suppose. So like right off the bat, I'm going to really quick shout out the thing I hate most in politics and my most frustrating topic in the world, which is gerrymandering. It is infuriating. For listeners that don't know what gerrymandering is, essentially when turf is cut a certain way politically so that voters will vote for a specific party. It's usually racial, and it also determines school district zones. And people don't tend to know that. Mr. Tibbens, if you have anything else you want to add for gerrymandering, I'm sure you know quite a bit about it.
I'm going to assume that was because you think I'm knowledgeable and not because you think I'm the guy doing the gerrymandering. I feel mildly targeted there. No, no.
No, I just, as a teacher, I assume.
No, it's a big deal, and it's something that this is where I teach very weird English classes because like we do a lot of anthropology and biology reading. Like I don't think they do enough of the race stuff in science classes, so I do it in English class. I think that history is incredibly important and interesting. But I don't think the average, not that no teachers do this, but I don't think the average history teacher does enough historiography, which is the study of how the history is written. You know, we tend to just do, here's the history, here's what happened, but you forget that someone had to write that textbook, and that not only did they have to tell you, you know, there's some bias in the words they choose, you also, we tend to forget that there's bias in what they chose not to put in the book. And so historiography is essentially like rhetorical analysis of the history. Like, why did they make these choices and why not? I do have a text or two that we've used in the past about gerrymandering, and I think it's something that is interesting because when you do it as a broad discussion, everybody tells you it's terrible. But when you start looking at certain communities or certain areas, or if you look at the justifications for like, you know, sort of the microcosms of like many like cultural areas within a city, and then someone tries to explain, well, we're trying to connect this and this and this. You know, if you're not careful, sometimes it starts to make sense. And it doesn't mean that it never can, but when you draw a voting district, say around like Houston, I think has a pretty sweet one. It's shaped like a horseshoe, like around the edge of Houston. And it's what you can't let anyone tell you that makes sense. And they'll do a good job of it, but it's bad for everybody because it means that people in other districts are going to be suppressed. Like those numbers are not playing out fairly. And this happens across the country is really the thing we have to be most careful of, because the things that, as you just said, in schools, almost all of your local tax dollars go to schools, schools and police. And if you don't have any control over your local, your county government, your state government does more to affect your daily life than the federal government ever does. And people forget, and they don't show up to vote, or they do vote, but they don't realize how weirdly shaped their districts are. And so, state government does a lot that affects people. And I would argue a lot of the things that we can and should be doing to address all sorts of inequality in society would probably best be handled or most easily handled at the state level, just because the federal government's so slow and bulky. But it's hard to get done because of gerrymandering, and so that's a big deal. So this is the thing that you hate most.
Well, I'm gonna do some interdisciplinary type of thing if I can. So essentially, with gerrymandering, it's infuriating because it kind of alters the representation that we see in schools. So from a basic standpoint, on an education level, you're already inhibiting students from interacting with those that are different than them, because certain parties will draw lines, and this is both sides of the aisle do this. Draw lines around districts that are going to have groups of people that are most likely to vote for them. And for listeners that don't know, that Virginia is was one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation, like top 5. And the courts of Virginia decided that was completely not okay. And so we've recently redistricted. There's still a lot of gerrymandering here, and especially in New Jersey. So that leads me to representation and sort of who we're talking with in intercultural exchange. So the thing that I think I lacked the most in my high school education was, despite our school being what felt like 60% Indian American, I didn't think that I necessarily knew how to talk to people that were different than me. Because obviously I'm Indian, so I was surrounded by people similar to myself, but we didn't have other ethnicities. We did, but it was pretty rare. And what was worse was things would be segregated in the weirdest way possible. Certain classes would be predominantly Indian, and certain classes would be predominantly white, and certain classes would be predominantly Black. And it was infuriating because you knew part of that was structural, and the way that kids grow up being taught and the privileges that they are afforded growing up, even in a really, really wealthy district. So I think intercultural exchange sort of tangentially is a really important skill that we don't know, because when I say I have these conversations with Germans about race, it's important because those kids might grow up and one of them might become a film director, and they might move to the US and make a movie that then, wins an award and is super important, but their casting might be off just because they don't know how to have proper representation or fight against tactics in the film industry that are inherently racist. There are certain casting techniques. And the reason we need intercultural exchange is because there are a lot of countries around the world, India, a lot of Asian countries, that deal with racism in ways that we don't even see it. And it's infuriating, but we have to be able to have those conversations. And that involves a lot of courtesy. It's not just rules, but, there's a lot of other, basic tactics and strategies involved when talking to someone very, very different than you. And again, so Grace talked about K through 12, specifically the below 6th grade, actually even let's go below 8th. Representation is everything, right? Growing up, there were no Indian princesses, right? Jasmine is an Indian American. So that was infuriating. And I'm sure it's way, way, way worse for the Black community because they just don't have that kind of representation in the media, right? There are very few Black leads. It's only recently that we've really been seeing that. And, with a Black woman being cast as the lead for The Little Mermaid was a huge deal. And it's just crazy. Kids don't grow up seeing themselves in movies as someone that can be loved or someone that is within a love story, or seeing themselves as someone that can run for president or an astronaut. Kids need to see someone who has lived their experiences doing what they want to do. And we lose so many children to dreams that they don't have anymore. We lose them to careers and passion or things that they just don't care about because we don't show them that it's possible. And on that note, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of education is civics education. So I still remember my 8th grade civics teacher, Missy Mom. She's amazing. And she's the reason I do everything I do. But she also taught me the importance of voting. She also taught me how our government worked, why committees are important, why who you elect at a local level is important, why representation matters, and it's not actually identity politics, but it's actually just progressive and moving us forward. And she was never once political, right? Like to this day, she could not align with my political views and I would never know. That doesn't mean that she didn't change my life, because she made me feel empowered. And that kind of civics education is not universal, right? It's not. I have friends in Ohio and I have friends across the country that haven't had civics education like that. And it can't just happen in 8th grade. We need to have civics education again before government. And you know what? Why is it that in AP government we teach so much than regular academic gov? Like, what is the issue there? The discrepancy, why is there a discrepancy? It's just an AP class. Like, the point is, every single student and individual needs to know how to use their voice, because we pride ourselves on being a democracy, on being the social experiment. And if we're going to try and execute it right, first we got to start with dismantling gerrymandering. But the next step is civics education, and it's definitely not ending there. So that's my rant.
And that's good. And real quick, Nikita, there was just a couple of things that I want to unpack real fast, and we'll get to Nikita. I think you're right about the idea of representation and seeing people that I don't know. I always feel like this is kind of a cheesy, I wouldn't call it a cliche because I don't hear it a lot, but I feel like this is a cheesy thing that I actually like. But people talk about how within English, say English teachers talk about how books can be, windows or like doors or mirrors, and we tend, and historically the use of the canon has been to use books as like doors into other worlds, or to see what people live like if they're richer or poorer or whatever else. But more recently, there's been this push for more multicultural and diverse literature with the goal of having books that function as mirrors that you can see yourself in, so that you learn about yourself and better understand your own experience. And I think the analogy works, which is why I stick with it. I always feel cheesy every time I say it. It's probably just because of how it was introduced to me. But I do think it's important. And one of the things I think is unfortunate about the way, one of personal bias here, but one of the many things that is disappointing about the Trump presidency is how much time and effort he's put into just undoing anything Obama did. But the one thing that he cannot undo, which I actually thought while Obama was still president, and he's far from a perfect president, but I generally like him as a person, was the idea that now you have an entire generation of young Black people who believe they can actually be president. Like you see him there, and he's a nice guy, and he's funny, and he gives great speeches, and like there's so much there to admire and respect, even if you disagree with some of his politics. And I think that that's the thing you can't undo, is that in another 20, 30, 40 years, you're going to have an entire generation of Black people who see the presidency or see elected office in a different light than their predecessors did. And I think that's important. So even if all of his policy and all of his regulations are gone by the time Trump's out of office, that's a piece that stays and I think has a massive impact. With that, like you can't, like I said, you can't undo it. And I think that in the long run, that's going to pay huge dividends towards some of the cultural change that we're going for. Nikita, I had a couple other things to say, but I don't want to hog the mic. Nikita, you had a couple ideas there. Go ahead.
I guess like Pooja kind of touched on this, but I guess everyone really did. But I think it's not just like how schools teach us, but it's a lot also like how they treat us. Like not to drop some bars, but they really, like, the problem is a lot deeper than just the curriculum. Like I remember was it yesterday? I don't remember when it was, but Henri, our speaker, Henri Samanjabi, he spoke about like how his own classmates and own teachers discouraged him from taking AP classes, or they looked at him funny, or were like, you shouldn't be here, you're a Black student. Like they made these basically like just like undermining, racially motivated, discouraging comments. And I've heard this time and time again, like, and it's not just like with AP classes, it goes further, like with colleges. I read a post, a bunch of these accounts that are surfacing on Instagram, like Black at a certain university or Black at a certain high school. And there were like posts I saw about, are from Black students who, when they had meetings with their guidance counselors, like counselors would be like, oh, you shouldn't apply there. Like it might be too much of a risk. It might be too much of like a stretch for you to even think about applying there. So I feel like it's like the educational part. It's also like the treatment, and also like, why do we have police officers in schools? I don't understand that. And I saw this another statistic that was like Black students, like they get expelled or arrested like 3 times more than the white counterparts. And it's like because of these policies that like are in schools that just don't even make sense. Like I don't understand why you would treat a kid with, what is it, a legal offense? I don't know, like just legal punishment for something that they did when they were a child. And I'm a strong believer in like people are born good, in my opinion, and then it's usually like their environment, their family life, something else that corrupts them. Or not corrupt, I hate that word too, but just like something that makes them more susceptible to do things that are seen as bad, kind of. And I don't think that the right way to go about those kinds of offenses is to like treat it with punishment, like expelling students, suspending students, arresting students, like all of those. I don't know. It's just for me, it just goes so much further than just like education. It's also like a lot of treatment and stuff that is.
I mean, you're right. And schools, I have been saying this for a while, and I'm saying it differently just in the last few weeks because of some of the popular discussions going on. But I think schools are trying to do too much. And as a result, we're not doing our core mission of education as well as we could be. It doesn't mean the other stuff isn't important. But as people have been talking about, unbundling or defunding the police, I kind of argue the same thing for schools. Not that students don't need mental health support, but that maybe there's a better way to deliver that than through school. Because when you're getting your mental health support in school, that also means they're pulling you out of class to do it, which also means you're falling behind in the class, which creates this extra stress. And it means that we're making this trade-off. And while in a perfect world, the teacher would just say, oh, don't worry about it. The reality is that that's just not really how school is set up. Like everybody's got a grade book and deadlines and the rest. Cops in schools, I feel similarly. I've known a couple of good school resource officers one guy I worked with, he was huge. He's one of the biggest people I've ever seen in my life. He was like a backup offensive lineman for like the Chicago Bears or something. Like he was like a house. He was huge. He was like the nicest guy, and he wore the plain like dress blue uniform, and he actually ended up like coaching the football team after school. Like kids would drop in to talk to him just to say what's up. That's a cop that's fine to have in school. I think that's great. More recently, the police officers that I've seen in the schools that I've worked in or visited, they're all wearing, like they've got the heavy bulletproof vest. I mean, they're a helmet and a shield away from SWAT gear, and that doesn't create a welcoming environment. That doesn't add anything, in my opinion. It doesn't add anything positive to the school setting. And I don't think that in any of the schools locally, we don't have the kind of violent crime in the schools that would necessitate a police officer, or at least not a police officer dressed that way. Like if we could go back to the officer-friendly Mayberry style, just like, hey, I'm a nice guy here just to help out. Like I can live with that, but that's not the way many officers present themselves. And I don't know what the numbers are now, but I read a study on this 3 or 4 years ago. Virginia, I think it was number 5 or 6 in the country for the number of students arrested in school. And it's because we make it a priority to put officers into schools. As you point out, there's a huge racial disparity in who gets arrested. But I also think that that's the same problem we see as the disparity of students who get detention, suspensions, et cetera. Like there are some things we can't have you in the school. You're a threat to the other people. Like there are some things that we should suspend or expel people for. But I think that those are rare. I think that for me, I always say in school suspension is the stupidest thing ever, because it's almost always because the kid was skipping or something. And it's like, so the punishment for skipping is to not be in class. Like all I'm trying to do is get this kid in the room so we can get some work done, learn something. And their punishment is to not be in the classroom, and so we need to be careful of it. But this is something that came up, and this actually sort of ties together your comments with a couple of things that Pooja just said. This came up in a discussion with Cameron Thompson on, I think it was the 31st episode of this podcast. And she's a rising senior, I believe, at Duke. And I taught her, and we stayed in touch. And so we did the whole episode just sort of on race and from her perspective as a Black woman. And she talked about how important it is to have Black teachers, or how she thinks we should have more Black teachers. And it goes back to the representation of when you see the teacher, and even if it's just simple as that person kind of looks like me, or maybe they make a reference to something in history, say like Mr. Curtis, the guy I referenced, like he does a lot of, there's a lot of value there, right? But I also think that sometimes we have this representation talk in tricky ways. And I'm going to remember the goal is growth. So I'm going to say a thing that I hope comes out well. And if this comes out poorly, I apologize in advance. But we've got 3 South Asian, or all Indian American, South Asian. Yeah. Okay. And we've got 2 white people. Could oversimplify it. And sorry, I don't care about your background. That's awful. But I mean, just within like, say this kind of group, when we talk about representation with teachers and say guidance counselors and things like that, we're almost always talking about, are there enough Black teachers? We almost never have the discussion like, why don't we have more Indian American teachers? We will occasionally do this with Hispanic teachers. The conversation usually revolves around how we need more Black teachers. We don't actually, in my opinion, have this enough. There are very, very few male elementary school teachers, which is, I think, a tricky thing. And I don't think we need to like hit a 50-50 or set a quota, but there's a lot of little boys that just don't behave well and could do better with another like male voice in their life, and they don't always get that. I'm wondering, in your opinions, why do you think when we have discussions about diversity in school staffs, it is almost always revolved around we need more Black teachers? But for the 3 Indian American people participating in this discussion, did you ever feel like you were somehow slighted or left out because you didn't have more Indian teachers? Like, why do we do this with one racial group and maybe we don't have this conversation in other areas?
I think it's a byproduct of racial stereotypes. I think the racial stereotypes surrounding the Indian American community or Indians in general is that they're super smart and don't need that representation. And that's just wrong, right? Like, I struggle with school just as much as the other person, and Roma can attest to that because she took 9th grade math with me and then I never took math again, right? So like, the thing is, everyone needs that representation, right? We even in our conversation just now, we've forgotten about the Native American community, and we've completely forgotten that, you know, they need representation too, because the stereotype is the stereotype is that it's really horrible. It's that they just drop out of school, and that's a byproduct of really horrible trail of tears and a really, 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 really horrible presidency that caused the trail of tears. And the stereotypes that have come from that, and the just like devastating like alcoholism and depression that has plagued a community whose fault is it's not their own. And so we forget about that community too. And I think it's because we assume that Black children are, you know, not smart. And so we're like, we need more Black teachers, but that's just wrong. Like, we need more Black teachers because we want to show kids that they can be anything that they want, not because they're a certain type of student.
And this is the part where I stopped myself before I said, this is the part where I'm going to probably say this poorly, do you think, and this is purely, you know, guessing, we're all just speaking on personal opinions here, but the stereotype of, say, the Indian American community is that, you know, and I have kids who joke about this in class all the time, that, you know, if I'm not a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or a computer scientist, my family will disown me, kind of deal. Like, do we think that there's part of this that for a lot of Black families, getting a college degree and getting a steady, safe teaching job with a pension is a look at it as a big step up for a lot of Black families? Whereas for maybe a lot of Indian American families, taking a teaching job is somehow frowned. I mean, I don't know, like, is that frowned upon? Is that, because I think that in some ways, you know, we talk about like teachers are underpaid and mistreated, and sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. And don't get me wrong, they'll always take more money, but I don't think it's as simple as just always pay everyone more and that's it. But I think when you think about your background or your family, a teaching job can look pretty sweet from one angle and can look like a huge disappointment from another one. And I wonder how much that factors into how we staff our schools. You know, you say we need to hire more diverse staff, and you go, well, look at the applicant pool, and you don't have a very diverse applicant pool. And if you took the names off every application and you just hire based on the numbers, you know, who has the best test scores, the whatever else, like, we end up with some pretty skewed results sometimes. And that's back to the institutional issue of like testing bias and all this kind of stuff. If we're serious about saying schools are a way to improve some of these things in our society, we've got to find new ways to do the hiring or new ways to attract staff. And I haven't found an easy way to do it, but I think a lot of it's because from, say, subculture to subculture, from racial group to racial group, whatever, the views of education or your inclusion within education are different. And so, you know, I always just think, how can we do school better to make the rest of this better? And representation is important. I don't know how we do it well.
Well, I think it's cultural. So again, this is where intercultural exchange and accurate understanding of other cultures is important. So I think every single Indian on this call is a first generation American. I know 1 second-gen Indian in all of the Indians that I know, which is 1.5 trillion, because there are just so many of us. And the thing is, right, when your parents want to come to the United States, this is the general story, right? It's like they are doing it to survive. And they're coming to the United States with, you know, very little money, or, and this is not the story for every family, but for my family, it was, you know, my dad got really sick and had to drop out of his college in India, and it was his family's dream for him to come to the United States. So he came on a scholarship to University of Washington, Missouri, And then they pulled his scholarship from under the rug, and he struggled and had to go to a different school that would give him a full scholarship. And that was Akron in Ohio. And essentially, he is an engineer. And the reason for that is because it's high in demand and it's a job that you can do. He also loves it, and that's really fortunate. And I think that stereotype can still play a role in a lot of Indian families now, because those our parents, like, that's what they knew. That's how they made a life for themselves, and they see it as a surefire way and a surefire solution. And while I know Roma here is pre-med, I'm not sure if Nikita is pre-med. I am not. Like, I am the most opposite possible person of pre-med you could possibly get. I finished high school and decided I didn't want to do my senior year and moved. Like, my parents are super supportive because they understand that there are alternative options, but it is a huge byproduct of the culture. And I think that's the reason we don't see a lot of Indian teachers, but also the exact reason why we need more Indian teachers, and why first generation American students like Roma and Nikita and I need to at least be told in schools that being a teacher is a good thing, because I would love to teach one day. And that's only because I have had Indian teachers.
Yeah, I mean, and again, the idea of, you brought up representation. And so that was where I think towards the end of the discussion with Cameron, we got to the idea of having more diverse school staffs. And her idea was essentially that when, she was speaking from the perspective of a young Black woman who's very smart. She's applying to medical school and all this stuff, that for her, like, teaching would be fine. And I think she'd be very good at it, but it is in certain ways sort of a step down. It's a lesser goal than the one she currently has. And she said that, and then she apologized. I was like, it's okay. I chose this job. Like, I'm the idiot. It's okay. But her idea was that essentially if you pay teachers more, it creates more respect, sort of more clout with the position. It makes it more desirable. And when it's more desirable, then when you see immigrant families or say Black families who are, upwardly mobile, then a teaching job doesn't look like a half step towards progress. It just looks like, hey, this is a great job, and do it. And I said, that's great. And again, I'd never argue against more money, but I also think that sometimes that's oversimplified. And so when we have the discussion of, what can we do in schools, like Grace, you said about some of the bias in your history class. And while you're not sure how much of that is the teacher, but at least some of it, maybe a lot of it's the curriculum, you have to start thinking about, how do we actually change schools? So we've been doing this for a while, and I have two sort of standard questions that we want to hit. And I have one other for you guys. So, but while we're doing school and before we get away from it, one of the things I ask people is, like, what is your ideal school? Like, how, if you had a budget and you could do anything you want with it, like, as long as the kids aren't injured or dead at the end, you can do it. Like, think of very free charter school, very little oversight. What would you do? And we've got 4 of you. And so, if you want to think, like, what would you do to make school better? And it might be related to racial justice. It could just be, hey, this would be better. I think one of the things that everyone's nodding. So I'm assuming that, finding ways to increase representation and diverse staffs is probably agreeable to most people. But what else do you think we could do that could make schools better, and hopefully eventually, as a byproduct, society as a whole?
I guess, like, I, again, already touched on this kind of, but taking out the severe ends of punishment, like expulsion, suspension, in-school suspension, arresting kids. Beyond, like, the really rare cases that you mentioned, like, for, like, the less severe things, like skipping class, or, like, if you are caught doing drugs, like, that shouldn't be punished with arrestment. I think that should be something that I haven't really thought about it enough, like, to say what I would offer as, like, an alternative solution. Probably mental health resources, but like you said, that would also mean taking kids out of class too. But maybe we could find an option for after school counseling, just something other than putting kids down, and, like, finding a way to uplift them even if they do wrong.
Be less punitive, and that probably varies school to school or division to division. But I think that's important. I think a lot of schools are moving in that direction, certainly not all. But maybe the thing that we're lacking is, as we're trying to suspend kids less, I'm not sure if we're doing such a great job of providing the additional, say, mental health supports and the rest. But yeah, I think that probably has some legs, like finding different ways to deal with the undesirable behaviors or with the personal problems. That's awesome. Yeah.
Also, dress codes. Get rid of dress codes. That's another thing.
I'm with you. Grace, you unmuted. So what do you got?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, obviously, because we wouldn't know how all of this would play out realistically. I guess the biggest thing that I would want to be addressed, and I don't know if this means throwing the whole system out the window or reforming the one that we have now, but I think it's important that we become more aware of the how deeply rooted white supremacy is in every system that we have, basically, specifically in education. So with what I was talking about before, like whitewashing history, and I feel like in some ways the curriculum is failing students in that they're taught that once they leave school, that information that they learn doesn't matter anymore. What at least in my experience, I would memorize stuff for a test, I would take the test, I would just forget everything that I learned. I think it's important that schools instill more of okay, this is a place that you're going to learn in, but when you leave, this still applies. This applies out of this building. And I feel like that's what a lot of students are missing. Also, I think it's important that we open up, and I guess I'm more focusing on like history classes, but we have to open up the dialogue and present these systems as they are, which is not perfect. At least for me, I was under the impression, or what I was taught, maybe in middle school more than high school, but it was that America is the best country in the world. We have the most freedom. We're the most important. We're the best at this and the best at that. And so what I was saying before about the cycle of ignorance, when you're taught that your country is great, and as a white person, racism and that doesn't happen to me, so I can go ahead and assume that it is. And if we're not given the opportunity to know enough information, I think that we're doing kids a disservice by not opening the conversation of like, well, let's critique this. Let's look at the past. Let's see how it's present now, and let's try to stop that from continuing in the future. Let's reform these systems. Let's abolish some of these systems. Let's get to work. Let's expand this knowledge outside of the walls of the school, because all of this isn't just a school thing. This needs to be an everywhere thing. The education should be more than just memorizing stuff to take a test. And I think that we really are doing our students a disservice by not opening up important conversations like that.
I think it's great. And I want to mention this quick because I don't think I've mentioned this since like the third episode with Jessica Berg, but it came up. I don't know how. She was talking about like teaching differently. And it was probably 10 years ago. I read an article about a guy who'd been teaching US history forever, and he was just like bored with it. And he kept realizing like they'd spend a week on the War of 1812, but they spend a few days on it. And as a result, but when you get to the end of the year, you got to cram for the test or the SOL or whatever it is. Your history class doesn't do enough with Vietnam. It doesn't do enough with the crack epidemic or the spread of AIDS in the 80s. Like, no one knows anything about the Iraq War. Like, I ask questions about the Iraq War or Afghanistan, and my students have no idea what I'm talking about. And so this guy started teaching history in reverse. He was like, so here's things going on now or in like the last 10 years. And he would pick like a couple of like key events or important ideas, and those would be the starting points. And then he would go backwards. So you just work back through the timeline, and they'd sort of interweave, and you'd see, well, this happened, which caused that other thing we did. And he would try to make sure he got to the American Revolution by the end of the year. But even if you didn't, it's so easy to find a YouTube video to say, hey, go watch the thing on the revolution. That's the answers you need for your test. And I thought it was brilliant. I also thought it's probably so different from a normal class that like I wouldn't be comfortable just asking any random history teacher to start doing that just all of a sudden. But I thought it was incredible because it changes the way you look at it. It changes the discussion, and it opens up the idea that the world you're living in today is as a result of the things in the past. And it means that you start with the things that are the most timely or most important to you. And so when you talk about like changing how we understand history and have that discussion, I don't know that that's what it would have to look like either, but there are at least some people trying to do these things and having these sort of interesting ideas. And that's one I always thought like, man, I don't know how I would teach the class myself, but I would love to take it. Like that would be such a cool way to see the connections and to sort of tell that story. So yeah, I mean, I think revealing the white supremacy everywhere, and then maybe especially being careful in how we have discussions and teach the history, probably really important. That'd be great. All right, what else we got? Who's next?
Yeah, so I guess these are more like hard things. I was writing a list when you asked the question because I want to work in like youth education reform. That's a really big, important thing to me, and education equity is important. But fewer tests, I don't mind deadlines. I think they keep people sort of moving. Like, I don't think deadlines are the devil, but I also don't think tests are, an every week type of thing. That's also inclusive of quizzes. Any teacher that gives you a quiz every week but says we only have tests once a month is lying. You study the same amount and it's just as unproductive. This is an unpopular opinion. I think kids should read. I really, 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 really think people should be reading. I think that they should know how to read a book properly. That isn't literate, not like don't be illiterate, but I mean know how to absorb the information and annotate a book and really engage with what they're reading. I think this is a huge privileged thing to say, but one thing I've seen at a private school, I've never been to a private school, but something that one of my friends has the privilege is her school offers an exchange program. Now, I don't think everyone should be afforded the money to go to France spontaneously, although you can do that on scholarships. I think that kids should have the chance to go to a different state and like stay with a host family in a county different than their own. And I think that would just be a huge step towards progress for intercultural exchange. But I also think we should have mandatory language classes that have an immersive component, because you can't talk to someone different than you if you can't actually speak to them in their own language, because they might know way more in their own language. I sound like the most hippie William and Mary kid in the world right now. Civics education, super important. One thing that I found super, super fun in high school, but also incredibly infuriating, was that there was an independent study class for science students, and I am not a science student, and I was very mad. And so I went and I did an independent study in my own time for the social sciences. And that was super fun, but it also took so much work to make something like that happen. I think we should be able to afford students the chance to independent study in any subject they want and turn that into their rock block, or I don't know what it's called now, flex, I guess. And I think that if we're going to have magnet schools, like in Loudoun County, there are 3 STEM magnet schools. We should have magnet schools for every field. Grace should be able to go to a magnet school for film and communication studies. I should be able to go to a magnet school for history. Where is this like incredible privilege of a lot of students to go to really fantastic schools if they're in STEM fields? It comes from the fact that they're afforded so many opportunities by just going to a magnet school, which I would have to move to Richmond to get to do. And better career centers, financial literacy, I think is really important and would bridge the gap between a lot of racial injustices, because I think a lot of families avoid talking about finances on a cultural level, or just families can't talk about finances because it might be a depressing topic, and that's valid, but we should still teach financial literacy in schools. I think also incentive for teachers. I think teachers should be able to create a class each year that they want to teach. I think they should be able to teach a class a year that they love for a period, and it can change every year. And I think that would be an incentive to keep teachers doing what they love. I think Ms. Berg loves teaching women and gender studies, and that is, she's also an amazing English teacher. But school isn't just about the kids, it's also about the people there. And if we wear out our teachers, then we're not going to get anywhere. And then I think we should always have retrospective education and introspective practices. So English classes are great for that. Free writes at the beginning are really fun. But I think like intercultural education, where we focus on looking back at our biases and familial, structures of racism in our own families or in our own cultures is important. And that was a long list, but yeah.
Can I add to that real quick? So 2 things. One thing, the thing that you said, Pooja, about like magnet schools around here only catering to like STEM kids. I think that's another part of the reason why like children in general, or like right now, like there's such hierarchy of subject. By making magnet schools only for STEM fields, you already immediately make that like hierarchy in kids' minds that like STEM is what you should aspire towards becoming, or STEM is what is like the future of America and like what everyone should want as a field, when that's not true at all. Like every field has value and every field should be valued in the same way. And then the second thing is like, not to disagree with you, Pooja, I definitely think books are like so undervalued as a resource, like especially like myself. I remember I used to have stacks of books like on my bedside table, like right next to me, but now not a single one, just because, I don't know, it just like felt like when I'm pushed to read certain books in schools, I lost interest in reading books for pleasure. And I think that's something that we should bring back.
It's great. Yeah. And by the way, just for the magnet school thing, I think that's, very slowly gaining traction, that people are starting to realize that as we're pushing back a little bit against standardized testing, we're realizing that standardizing education is not necessarily making people happier, more productive, that maybe to a certain extent we need to specialize education a little bit. It doesn't mean that what you choose in 9th grade you're stuck with forever or anything like that. It's just, let people kind of do what they're into. And I interviewed Ian Sirotkin, who's now on the Loudoun County School Board, when he was still running, when he was a candidate. And when I said, what would you do if you could do anything you want with schools, which is a loaded question. We were asking someone running for school board. And that was actually he said he would like for each of the high schools to have a specialty. And so that you go to your high school, but on every other day, you might actually be attending a different school. And that way you didn't have to build a new building. You just created like a specialized department in each one. And he's like, I don't know how we would, the logistics or funding. He's like, but I think that kids should have the opportunity to specialize and do the things they want to do. And I thought that was a really cool idea and maybe a way to do it building on what we already have. And that's the thing that's tricky is, it would be great to just have this question as reality, like in a vacuum, just, I have all this money, I can do anything I want. The reality is you have a structure in place that while it has many flaws, it also has some things that work. And I wouldn't want to risk throwing away a tax base, and you have real estate, like you have all this stuff, And so for me, it's always like, how do we do it better with what we have? Because if we wanted to start from scratch, I think we might have a better result, but it would be so time consuming and so contentious. And so, and so the idea of reform in education, I think, is really important, because I'm not sure that a fresh start is either going to happen or is something we could do. Roma. So they, between Pooja's, treatise there, and we got a lot of good ideas. You get to go last, though, which means you get to say anything you want. What do you think would make school better, or what would you do in a school of your own?
Well, since everybody kind of talked about everything else, I'm going to be the stereotypical student, and I'm going to advocate abolishing tests like anything produced by College Board. I think when we base the curriculum off of a test, we limit a lot of the things that we are learning. And I think that contributes to why a lot of the things that we do learn are so, as Grace said before, white-centric or Eurocentric. Also, there are a lot of things that I learned in college about how to study, because when you go to college, you basically relearn how to get educated. And a lot of the things we did in college, the one thing that I really, really like is that it's so hard to find a classroom that uses a standard textbook. We learn all of our material through different essays, different podcasts, different television shows, or like episodes or documentaries. And it makes it a lot easier to talk about the possible biases that come with this work, but at the same time, we're still learning the content that we need to know. And so I think schools could benefit a lot from just getting rid of textbooks, and instead of using textbooks, using essays or different articles to teach the same material, and it gives a little bit of like leniency as to what you're learning as well.
I think it's great. And that actually ties in nicely with what Nikita said about, the reading. I'm with you. Like, I have a long commute, and so I tear through audiobooks, and all of a sudden, we close schools and I stop driving. And like, now I don't read or listen to hardly anything. Like, I read to my kids, but I do very little legit reading. I read tons of articles. I read a lot of stuff on my phone. I almost never sit down and read a book. And it's mostly just because I've sort of gotten out of the habit. But Nikita, to your point, it's because reading started to feel like work. Like when I was young, I read a ton. In college, I read a ton because I had to. And then as soon as I started teaching high school, like reading was work. Like I was reading things because I was going to teach it, or I was reading students' essays. And it stopped being something that I did just for enjoyment or free time. And I still try to, but it just doesn't happen the way it used to. And it's because I got out of that habit. So Roma, that might even tie in, because if we did a better job of using the short pieces, the selections, the excerpts, the short texts, then it means you're not asked to read the big bulk all at once, which maybe would mean that reading doesn't feel like quite as much work. I mean, I don't know if that's how everyone would respond, but it might have that nice sort of silver lining, is that, when you pick up a book, you actually feel like you can enjoy it, because you know that the targeted readings for class were done in those smaller pieces. All right, so moving away from school for a minute, because I have one other sort of question I wanted to bring up. Allies for Black Voices is being run in coordination with or in conjunction with NOW, right? Which is the National Organization of Women, National Organization for Women, of Women? For women. And so the Loudoun County chapter of NOW is sort of working with you, or you're working with them, et cetera. And I know that Ms. Berg is, I think, the vice president of that organization, the local organization now. And so that's part of the tie-in. I'm just curious about how the sort of the intersection of feminist issues and race issues has played out in your project specifically. Like if we could do an entire another podcast just on that issue. So I don't want to actually talk about the intersection of feminism and racism, right? I do, but we shouldn't because we're already going long. But specific to your project, how did it come about that now was the organization that helped to facilitate? Or if you can, I don't know, in a short sort of way, what's the connection between Now's mission and Allies for Black Voices mission?
I ended up finding Loud National Organization of Women because Barb Jones, whom we all love very dearly, if she hears this, Barb, we love you, is the president of the Loudon chapter of Now. And she is someone that helped me start my organization when I was 15, and that organization was training young women to run for office. So I think that's sort of the intersection was, like, as a woman of color, I was doing something in women's rights when I was younger, and that's how I got to know Barb. And now Barb works in a multitude of things, but she also was starting to do a little bit more work in race issues. And I think the general history of the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter movement is women tend to be good at uplifting it. Again, the white women are, there's a lot that can be analyzed there in terms of the history with white women and racism. But nonetheless, the feminism movement and the civil rights movement have usually come hand in hand, and intersectionality is becoming a bigger thing. So for being honest, it was kind of by chance that Barb was running Loud National Organization of Women. This would have still happened even if she was working, somewhere else. Or if we were just working with her alone or Miss Berg alone, this would have still happened. But it's just happy chance that we're repeating history by seeing feminism and race relations sort of walk hand in hand.
So it's kind of a fortunate synergy of whatever, and you're right that, like I said, we could do an entire podcast just on dealing with the intersections between the two. And we could probably do a little fun thing looking at, the early women, the early suffragettes and the discussion of whether or not they would include Black women in those meetings. And I mean, that almost split the early women's rights movements in the late 1800s. That was a huge deal. I think the discussion, at least as far as I know, goes a little bit differently and maybe better now, as you pointed out, that maybe a lot of women's rights organizations are more inclusive and do a better job than maybe was done in the past. I was just curious because, I know that there's a lot of things that could connect. I just didn't know. So this started with the four of you. And then, you just had connections to people who could help you to organize and put together the platform. And so you take advantage of those connections. So that's good. I didn't know if there was talk of this going on in any other places or things like that. All right. So books or movies. And as I told you before, you can do this related to race. This could be related to feminism. This could literally just be something you like because you found it entertaining. But I always ask for a couple of books or movies that you have enjoyed or that have positively affected you that you would recommend to other people. And then when I put this up on the webpage, I usually link to them so people can check them out. So what are a couple things that each of you might want to recommend?
Well, I mentioned this earlier, but 13th on Netflix, that changed my perspective on everything. It's become more popular nowadays with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I know a lot of people have been turning to that movie as a resource, and I would definitely recommend that one. I am not huge on reading, so I do prefer to listen to podcasts. Sorry, Pooja. And I have started listening to Small Doses with Amanda Seales. Oh, When They See Us. That's on Netflix. That's a show about the Central Park Five. That was eye-opening. I would definitely recommend that as well. So yeah, those are my big recommendations. If
you like 13th, just general recommendation. It's great. It's excellent movie. It is, and I don't want to steal its thunder in case anyone's going to recommend it, but it's based in part on The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which it's not like an entertaining read per se, but it is great. And the research is fantastic. And so it talks about how the war on drugs essentially is the new Jim Crow. And so that goes really well. I actually used 13th in my English class a couple times until they blocked Netflix in school. But before 13th came out and then after they blocked it, I think some of you might really enjoy. It's called The House I Live In by Eugene Jarecki. He's a great documentarian, and it basically does the same thing, but it doesn't address the prison labor issue so much as how the war on drugs began specifically on racist grounds and how it now affects sort of America as a whole, and we have this massive prison population. So as a mass incarceration thing, the house I live in is really good to tie in with that. And I say, I've never met anyone who liked 13th and didn't like the other one, or vice versa. Nikita, what would you recommend?
So I think Grace took one of mine. When They See Us, I was going to recommend that as well. It broke my heart, but it was something that everyone needs to see. And then additionally, I would say Time, Khalif, which is, it's Time, Khalif read a story. It's on Netflix. It's another documentary that it will shatter you, but the things that they talk about are just like, it's just the stories that get washed away. That, like, his story is something that I know is probably way more prevalent than just this one case. And it's just really sad to see that it just goes under the rug or whatever. And then I would say The Hate You Give, which is a movie. I read the book first. Hopefully Pooja is happy to hear that. And then I watched the movie, and that was another really good one. It talks about police brutality, and it's from a teen perspective, which is something you don't see often. And then I would say I read this in a class in college, but it's a paper by Kimberly Crenshaw called, oh my God, the title is really long. It's called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. And that was like, it was dense, but it was important because I think that was the paper, and she was the woman who coined the term intersectionality, and that was the paper where she like really expanded on the idea. And I guess the last thing is a podcast. It's free on Spotify. It's called The Prison Industrial Complex by Angela Davis. And I listened to that in one day, and again, her ideas are just like, they need to be heard. So yeah, that would be my list of things.
Awesome. That's great. All right. So we're just going to go in the order around my screen anyway. So Pooja, what would you recommend?
So I have some books first, which will shock no one. So my favorite book is The Sun Does Shine, I believe it's called Finding Life on Death Row by Anthony Ray Hinton. If you have heard of Bryan Stevenson, who I'm sure everyone in the world has at this point, he was Anthony Ray Hinton's lawyer. Anthony Ray Hinton was wrongfully put on death row for 30 years. And it's his story, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. It's written by him. And then there's Personhood by Leo Buscaglia. I gave this book to Grace earlier this summer. Grace does not read, but it is still one of my favorite books. Very different, not about race relations at all, but it is about how to become a whole human being, and I think that is incredibly valid. It's written by a former USC professor. Nectar in a Sieve is a book I read at school this year at William & Mary, and it is about a whole bunch of things, but essentially about child marriage, which is a near and dear topic to my heart. And then Becoming by Michelle Obama, which is a great book. Read it in 2 days. The Good Earth, which was on Oprah's book club. If you haven't noticed, a lot of these books, I think like half of them are from Oprah. And then the last one is Hillbilly Elegy, which came out a few years ago, took the world by storm when it did come out. I think I read it the year it came out. It changed my entire perspective on civil discourse. And then I do have a couple podcasts. So I really like Pod Save America and Pod Save the World. These are both great. There's a podcast called The Brown Girl's Guide to Politics, which I find intriguing because I'm a brown girl in politics. And then the last one is Working Class History, which is a history podcast, which just does different lessons on different historical events, and it's intriguing.
Awesome. So that's all right. So we got a lot going on there. You know, I'm going to reveal a dirty little secret. I record this podcast, and, you know, at least based on anecdotal feedback, it's going well, and, you know, numbers are going up and all that. I don't listen to podcasts. People are like, so how do you know what you're doing? I'm like, I just like talk to people and we record it, and I hope it doesn't suck. And so, you know, like you guys are giving recommendations. I'm like, well, I at least have to check out like some of each of these, because one, they're probably good, and two, maybe they would make me better at what I'm trying to do here. Because, like, yeah, you know, who writes a book without ever having read one? You know, I hear that somebody actually suggested a few episodes ago. They're like, we know we're already videotaped. Why don't you just post this? And I was like, well, because, you know, then we can say something stupid. It's easy to edit audio. It's hard to edit the video. And I was like, I don't know. Maybe someday I'll get fancy. All right, so a lot of good stuff there. Excellent. And then Roma, what would you recommend, books or movies you like?
Awesome. So one movie, and it's based off of the book of the same title by Bryan Stevenson, is called Just Mercy. And it talks about capital punishment and the racism that exists in our justice system, and how that disproportionately affects Black people. It absolutely broke me watching the movie. We watched it together, me, Grace, and Nikita, and I sobbed the entire time.
Yeah, she cried like a baby whole time.
The entire time, not a single time my eyes were dry, but it's so important to watch.
I finally finished it, and then we watched the movie, and my wife at first like, what are we watching? I don't want to deal with this. I don't, and then she sobbed for like the entire movie and got done and immediately was like texting friends like, you have to watch this thing and we've got to do something. I'm like, wow, they put it together pretty well. The book was fantastic, but yeah, so if you were crying through the movie, I know at least one other person that, went through an entire box of Kleenex on that one.
God, I was really wrecked after that movie. I have a book that I read actually in high school, which really, this is more about Native Americans and their experiences on the reservation. It just opened my eyes to how truly horrible some of their situations are. But it's written in the perspective of a high school student. So at the time, it made understanding these topics really, really easy. And it was a really quick and good read. It's called The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sharma and Alexi. I would recommend everybody read that at least once in their life. A podcast that I really like that closes the gaps on a lot of the things that I felt like my history classes left out on. It's by Time. It's called 1619, and it is free, and it is on Spotify. And it talks about slavery and the implications of slavery that are still present in our nation and how it contributes to systemic racism in a bunch of different areas. And then this is an essay that I read in college that completely changed my entire perspective on what it means to do activist work and what it means to try and support your community and other communities. It's called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House by Audre Lorde. And it made me think really, really hard about white feminism and different types of feminism that tend to silence other voices to get their own agenda across, and how we sometimes do that unintentionally. But it's such an important read, completely changed how I see everything. And the last one, it's a thick one, so you would have to take your time and listen and really read it. But anything by Bell Hooks is amazing. She's a feminist author, and I really like her book, Feminism is for Everybody, because it just outlines the entire feminist agenda, at least for Black feminists and feminists in general. And so I really like that book too.
Fantastic. So now, thanks a lot. I have a lot of reading to do that I've actually, I won't say from every podcast, but from most, when people give their recommendations, I usually end up going out, and buying one of the books or audiobooks, and some of them I've gotten through, and I have like this like massive list, like, piling up, and talking to 4 people at one time did nothing to dig me out of that hole. I feel like now I have homework. Just to toss a couple titles, I mentioned, I mentioned The House I Live In. If you enjoyed 13th, or especially if you like Just Mercy, there's a book that they actually reference. I didn't know this. They reference it at the end of Just Mercy, but it's called Slavery by a Different Name, or Slavery by Another Name. I think the author's last name, is Blackman. And it addresses peonage, like the convict leasing that occurs after the 13th Amendment. It's fantastic. I mean, you have to be a little bit into history. Like, they do some good human interest stories and focus on real people and their experiences. But, when anytime somebody's like, well, slavery ends in 1865, so what do you, and it's like, nah, there's like legit slavery for tens of thousands of people until like 1945. And in certain ways, until today. But that was fantastic as a history text. And then just for the whole interdisciplinary studies thing, the idea that I think maybe Roma said how like you don't learn the history of the science when you're doing it or whatever. A book that I absolutely loved, and it's long, but man, it's so cool. It's called A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. And it is so good because he teaches you like the history of like all of the science. Like, you get geology and biology, you get all this incredible stuff. but he does the history of who actually invents it and thinks of it. And so it's a little bit long, but he's just a very like fun, interesting guy. He has a good voice as a writer. But for anyone who feels like, you know, you were gypped in school because your history and science didn't go together well enough, that is just like a really cool one. And I only I almost said it earlier and then I didn't want to interrupt, but there's an awesome list here. So I'll make sure I try to compile this. Oh, hey, there we go. Pooja's holding the book up. Yeah, it's awesome. I think I own like 2 copies and I have the audiobook and it's great. So I'll compile this list and I'll include it on the website when I put them up, because as we referenced before, that, you know, sometimes one of the most important things to do to help people both to learn but to engage in conversations about race or about feminism, about any of these issues, is to have access to good information, to have access to good materials. And so, you know, I recommend anyone listening to check out, you know, potentially all of these. So that might take a while, but, you know, I think that most people could find at least a few things on that list that could support their personal goals or the goals of the local community. Before we wrap up, I always just do sort of general open mic, and there's no pressure or anything here, but if anyone would like to plug or promote, say, upcoming events for Allies for Black Voices, or if you feel like there's anything that we either didn't discuss in the recording that we should have, or that we didn't do, you know, give proper respect or time to, then this is your chance to remedy any of that. So if there's anything you'd like to promote, clarify, or add on, open mic, the mic is yours.
We do have speakers planned every week for the rest of the summer, which is awesome. If you follow us on Instagram, it's at Allies for Black Voices. I am primarily in charge of the account. We have this thing called Upcoming Session Sundays, where I make the flyer, I post it on Sundays, and it'll show the session for the upcoming week. So, and the date and the time and the information and all that. So the easiest way to keep up with all of this is on Instagram. So if you are interested, feel free to follow it. That's where we have all our information, and we are so excited for the rest of the summer and to continue this in the future. I was just going to say, I forgot, also the YouTube channel that we've talked about, it's also, if you just look up Allies for Black Voices, because I know a lot of times these sessions are during the week, and if people aren't able to come, we totally understand, but we record them, we upload them to the channel in full, and so far they've been pretty lengthy, but, and I've done that, despite the fact that I've been to the sessions, I've rewatched them. So yeah, also be sure to check out the YouTube in case you're not able to attend these sessions.
Awesome. So when I post this, I will, of course, like I've got, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. I will link to your accounts when possible, and we'll try to make sure we steer some people in your direction. We covered a ton of ground. I know we went a little over time here, so I apologize if anybody's like staring at the clock, but we got a lot of really good information about Allies for Black Voices. I think we also got into some good stuff about just cultural issues in general, and even hit on some of the specifics in terms of how school reform can contribute to some of the broader goals to create both greater opportunity and more justice in our society. So I think that this has actually been great. I've learned a lot, so I appreciate you taking the time. And if anyone who's listening is interested, please check www.classcastpodcast.com, and I will link to their accounts and to their website, which you can find at loudouncountynow.org/allies for Black Voices. There's some hyphens in there, so I'll provide the link. Thank you all for taking the time to meet, and thank everyone for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.